compréhension que j'ai du matriarcat, c'est que dans la passation du pouvoir, ce qu'on appelle l'héritage, c'est du côté des sœurs du détenteur du pouvoir qui se trouve la succession. Et du côté en termes de patriarcat, c'est du côté des frères.
Okay, thank you. Patriarchy is a system of family relations that privileges masculinity, privilege maleness, it's not the same thing. Maleness, masculinidad, and maleness, two different things. Maleness and inheritance through the male heir. But patriarchy came after probably 10,000 years of struggle. The dominant form of human relations is based on matriarchy. Because the matriarchy is based on caring and familyhood. It is patriarchy that centralizes inheritance, property, and wealth. And you set up social systems and religion, which privileges men. All religions prior to the victory of patriarchy, the goddess principle was the dominant principle. So you cannot separate patriarchy from the male god. The male god, not the male god, was the victory of patriarchy and dictatorship. Because in previous societies, gods were more democratic. There were gods and goddesses. And the democratic relations at the spiritual level mean that we could go to different spiritual entities for water, for rain, for food. So we had a more democratic relations with nature. So Sheikh Anta Diop, this book he wrote, the importance of this thing is a concept of Africa that is rooted in matriarchy, matriarchal family, the territorial state, the territorial, which is different from the nation state, because we don't have such a thing in Africa. That nation state is a recent phenomenon of 200 years ago that Europeans came up with. So matriarchy, matriarchal family, territorial state, emancipation of women in domestic life, ideals of peace and justice, goodness and optimism, novels, tales, fables, comedy, dance, music, singing. These are all elements of the cultural unity of Africa. And those things that brought us to the humanization of the planet were turned against us to say you're barbaric because you don't have nations, you don't have patriarchal family. So when we talk about the cultural unity of Africa, we're dealing with a complex phenomena. We're dealing with unity and diversity. In other words, if we take Albert Einstein and physics as our starting point, we should not see unity as an imagined uniformity. Unity must be expressed through the multiplicities of diversities. You can write this down because this is so fundamental to the cultural unity of Africa. It's not simplistic. We're not black, we're not white, we're not Indian, we're not... Africa is diverse and rich. That is part of our richness, our diversity. I'll repeat. Unity instead must be expressed through the multiplicities of diversity. Universality then becomes the unitary significance of our diversities. So in our democratic institute, not governance, our democratic institute, the challenge is the management of diversities in Africa. Because in Africa, what people do is manipulate diversity for the accumulation of capital. So people become tribes and religions and Muslims and Christians and Kikuyu and Luo and Yoruba and so we are not working on a democratic principle. We're working on a principle which doesn't highlight our diversities. Let us look at some of the diversities. We have diverse reflections. Most of us still celebrate our goddesses. If you come from Nigeria, the most powerful deities in Nigeria are the goddesses, the Mami water. We have rituals, and every ritual in Africa has a musical form. We have languages. That is one of the wealth of Africa, because within the languages of Africa are hidden the technology of Africa's transformation. We have diverse peoples, ethnic groups, races, and peoples of Africa. And so our philosophical starting point for Africa is one of emancipation, and a word that the South Africans have made popular, Ubuntu, which means that you're a person. Unfortunately, because of capitalism in South Africa, they've cheapened this concept. But Ubuntu means humanness, willingness to share, love, forgiveness, reconciliation. Ubuntu penetrates and distorts Western concept of equality. And if we look at the practitioners of Ubuntu, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Julius Nyerere, and those who brought an ethical value to political leadership, we can see how they have made great contributions to the rights of human beings. So from this ontological starting point, we have an epistemology which is concerned with the theory of knowledge especially in regard to its methods, validation, and the ways of gaining knowledge. So epistemology focuses on knowledge. You really can't learn much if you focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Because sub-Saharan Africa is communicating ideas of tropical Africa, black Africa, Hegelian Africa. And yesterday we discussed here about the Hegel conception of Africa. Everybody remember we discussed that yesterday? Who brought it up yesterday? Who brought that? Good. Could you repeat it for the class?
L'Afrique a un climat extrêmement chaud qui ne permet pas le développement de l'intelligence de l'être humain. Je pense que c'est une approche ou bien une manière de Hegel de dire que l'être humain africain est un être très inférieur. Merci.
Thank you. In other words, the philosophical basis of Western European entry point was reproduced since the 15th century. It wasn't there before. It wasn't there before the 15th century. It arose in the process of the development of capitalism. So by the 19th century, when Hegel was writing, at this point, we leave Africa. Not to mention it again, for it is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. Historical movement in its northern part, that is the Middle East, North Africa, belong to the Asiatic and European world. What we properly understand by Africa is unhistorical. Underdeveloped spirit, still involved in the conditions of mere nature, and which had to be presented here as on the childhood of world's history. The history of the world travels from east to the west. For Europe is absolutely the end of history, and Asia is the beginning. So let's leave Africa behind. That is the fundamental core of racism in Western philosophy, which is internalized by African scholars. And especially some of them who call themselves Marxist-Leninists, because their Marxism is based on Hegelian philosophy, and Hegelian philosophy of the spirit talks about the underdeveloped spirit.
Interestingly, by the way, Prof, it's the point that Hegel was never in Africa.
Huh?
He never traveled to Africa. Hegel.
Of course not.
Yeah,
No,
which
yeah.
is strange that he could write all that.
Je pense que là où le professeur a relevé que Hegel n'a
The
jamais
mic, please.
là où le professeur a relevé quand il dit que Hegel n'est jamais arrivé en Afrique avant de produire des connaissances sur le continent africain, je pense que ça m'interpelle en tant qu'anthropologue, parce que selon les données anthropologiques, je prends juste les deux courants classiques de l'anthropologie, l'évolutionnisme et le diffusionnisme. Ces deux courants anthropologiques supposent que le monde a deux pôles. Il y a un pôle de civilisation et un pôle de non-civilisation. Donc le pôle de civilisation, c'est le pôle de l'Occident, de l'Europe, et que les pôles de non-civilisation, qui est le pôle de l'Africain, donc nous sommes à l'étape de la barbarie, et que nous devons évoluer de façon linéaire en passant par la sauvagerie avant d'aller vers la civilisation. Et tous ces discours ont été construits par des gens, je le précise, qui n'ont jamais fait l'Afrique. Je prends le cas du VIe siècle que nous considérons comme le siècle des grands voyages, où des noblesses des familles de l'Europe ou de l'Occident ont envoyé des gens en Afrique pour venir découvrir un continent dont on parlait, le continent des sauvages, le continent où les gens ne pensent pas. Donc ces gens-là sont retournés avec quelques matériaux qui sont venus construire le continent africain. Et à travers ces données empiriques, les gens qui étaient, nous on les appelle les anthropologues de bureau, qui étaient en Europe ou bien à l'Occident, qui n'ont jamais fait l'Afrique, ce sont eux qui ont construit des discours sur le continent africain. Donc c'est en cela ça m'a interpellé. Je voudrais quand même le partager avec mes collègues. C'est très important de le dire parce que c'est un propos de formation. Et on parle de l'étape de la barbarie pour aller à la sauvagerie, mais c'est ce que nous voyons encore aujourd'hui. On dit pays non développés, pays sous-développés, pays en voie de développement. Et dans tout cela, l'Africain même ne participe pas aux réflexions. C'est dans une approche non participative et que c'est les Occidentaux eux-mêmes qui, à leur manière, selon les critères, selon leur idéologie, leur profil, leurs intérêts, ils collent à l'Afrique des étiquettes que nous-mêmes nous ne comprenons pas. Merci.
Thank you. Let me come back to something Hegel said. Africans are still involved in conditions of mere nature. In other words, something that is rich in Africa, that is used to preserve the planet, is turned against Africans. What does Hegel mean by Africans still in the conditions of mere nature? Shingarai. Every child in Zimbabwe grow up to know what their totem is. Could you explain to the class what do we mean by their totem?
Okay, basically what happens in Zimbabwe is that every clan here identifies itself with a totem, and in most cases it is...
All cases.
Or in all cases.
Yes.
Yeah, it is an animal,
Yeah.
like take for instance an elephant. So what happens is that they look at an elephant and they say, our clan, we are the elephant.
That's right.
And so because of that, the traits of those people will relate to that animal. For instance, we also have the lion. The men are aggressive, and we have, for instance, we also have the monkeys. Those who have the monkey as a totem also behave more like monkeys
Okay.
in some way. So it's like people behave in accordance with their totems.
Go.
Okay, thank you. We have a similar system in Botswana, but for us it's a bit different because we relate to the animals. We don't behave like them, but we conserve them in a way, because if you come from a tribe that has a crocodile as a totem, then you can't eat a crocodile because of superstitions and whatever. So it's a way of conserving natural resources in an indigenous way, if I may say.
Thank you. Every African had totems. The banishing of totem came with Islam and Christianity. The more you are Islam or Christianity, then the further you move away from your totem. Because it means that your link to the democratic understanding of nature is broken by the patriarchy embedded in Islam and Christianity. And the more Christian you are, the more you say, oh, me, I don't believe in those things that Africans believe in. I don't have any totem. That's just the barbaric people. You're just saying what Mr. Hegel is saying. Yeah. Can we go on now? Can we continue? Are we together about the concept of Africa that's operational for this institution?
I think what you should, maybe you could also try and clarify, Prof, is those that use south of the Sahara, are they also equally wrong?
Yes.
Because, yeah. I saw Rodney does that.
He used the south of the Sahara because he was trying to designate a place, but he didn't talk about, he didn't exclude Tunisia or Libya or Algeria from his analysis of the imperialist partition of Africa. Okay? All right. Now, so, African scholars are thrown in a quandary. So although Africans always came up with the idea of Africa, which was created by the enslaved African, it's the enslaved African who created Africa. Why? Here you are, you're captured from some place in Futajalon, and you're taken to Brazil, and you're pitched next to someone from Brazil, someone from the Congo, you're pitched next to someone from Ghana. It is there you created a bond of a unified force. It didn't exist before. Because you never saw yourself as someone outside of the kingdom of the Mosi, or the kingdom of Ghana, or the kingdom of Yoruba. So the African concept was developed by the enslaved because it was articulating a concept of a place where there was freedom. Is this very clear? And the Pan-African movement promoted the idea of Africa. So W.B. Du Bois then wrote about the world and Africa, which then goes back to understanding Africa in history. Relax, my brother. But we have African philosophers who now think that Africa didn't exist. And so we have someone called Mudimbe called the invention of Africa. Gnosis, philosophy, and the order of knowledge. Mudimbe accepts the starting point of philosophy of Western Europeans and the division between Africans and between Christians and Muslims. We don't have time to go into that, but we do not accept this invention of Africa of Mudimbe. What we are working with is the Pan-African conception of Africa, which deals with the global African family. The global African family says what I've been saying before, that Africans are human beings. We're not beasts of burden. And we define ourselves.
Can I ask a question, Prof? So yesterday I asked whether it was relevant or of concern to point out that the person narrating the video that we watched was a white person, and in your response you said relevant and that he was a Pan-Africanist. So when we're talking about Pan-Africanism or Pan-Africanist, does the color of your skin matter? So what defines you?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the question. Africa as a place has many different human beings. those different human beings, and that's why we talk about the diversities of Africa, different ethnicities, different language, different phenotype. An African from Ethiopia, who after 10,000 years of relations between Ethiopia and Arabia, looks different from an African from Nigeria. So in Africa, one of the constant things is about migration and welcoming people. Now, we had different peoples coming into Africa as a result of colonialism. We can give you three. One, Europeans. Two, Indians. Three, Chinese. The definition of whether those people are Africans comes from their practice in relationship to Africa. So if Joe Slovo is in the liberation movement, we're going to say, well, he's a European, we don't want him, but we want Mobutu Sese Seko because he's black. That is why our definition of human being goes back to the fundamental basis of what it means to constitute. But of course, this blackness takes on a particular political significance because of racism. So the Basil Davis will not feel the same way as I do because he does not have that experience. Because this blackness is itself a political factor which is added into the mixture of what is being African. So black consciousness becomes part of being African. It doesn't mean that it excludes someone that does not have black consciousness. So if I have my cousin who comes from Egypt, who is the wife of Kwame Nkrumah, I don't exclude her because she doesn't have black consciousness. My history gives me that entry point to understand black consciousness. But my black consciousness doesn't define me so that I'm no longer a human being, I'm just black. It's a political thing that comes out of my anti-racist struggle. It's not because I want to dominate white people. What I want to do, I want to humanize white people. And I cannot humanize them under capitalism. But that's the task we have assigned ourselves as Africans. The task we have assigned ourselves is to humanize the planet. Okay, in South Africa, yes, Michael.
Yes, more clarification on that. When we were talking about African epistemology,
Yes.
and I think that is also where my sister is also trying to dig so that we understand the concept better. Is Africa a place? Yesterday, you actually talked about...
We're coming to that now, right now.
Yeah, maybe...
We're coming, that's exactly what we're coming to.
So secondly, maybe I leave that. Yesterday you actually reinstated your ambivalence as an African scholar. Given you are not from the place...
No, it's not it's my ambivalence in relationship to organizations like CODESRIA. CODESRIA has internalized over the years the idea that they don't deal with Africans outside of Africa.
Okay. So
not my ambivalence to it. It's towards organizations that predispose themselves because of their links to Western agency that they should not include Africans who are part of the global African family.
Okay. So how do we now define an African scholar?
Well, we define an African scholar by that scholarship which is driven by the project. It doesn't mean that non-Africans cannot be part of the project. For example, an African scholar has a project. What is the project? We want to be human beings.
It can be any person. That is what...
Yeah, but it can be any person, but the specificity of racism gives a political charge to the black person, which Joe Slovo will not have. Although Joe Slovo is fighting for the liberation of Africa, he's not fighting for the same anti-racism as I am. Huh? So I'm not going to exclude Joe Slover because he's not anti-racist with the same passion that I am.
So does that accept the concept of negritude, which was...
We're coming to that. We're coming to that. Okay. Now in South Africa is a place that is very large African university system, so there are a lot of contention. There's a scholar in South Africa who has written on four concepts of Africa. Four concepts of Africa. The South African scholar has written 4 concepts of Africa. The first concept of Africa is Africa as a place, a geographical space. You can't deny that. It's a geographical space, that is true. But for me, it's more than that. Africa is also about people and human beings. That's one concept of Africa. Number 2, Africa as a commodity to be claimed and exchanged. And in capitalism, when everything is to be commodified, Africa becomes a commodity. And we know this because the very process of developing the system in which we live now was built on creating Africans as commodities. As Walter Rodney said, to the Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish, the African became like a piece, measurable in practically the same way as a piece of cloth. English slave traders referred to Africans as servants. Official language denoted Africans as a thing. African men and women were things like gold, ivory, beeswax as commodities. So the capitalist system has seen Africa as commodities. So we have Africans as a place, as commodities, as a condition. What kind of condition? To be civilized, to be pacified, to be modernized, to be governed. And out of that condition comes civilization, pacification, modernization theory, governance. That is the condition of Africa that comes from the concept of Africa as a condition. And then we have the concept of Africa as an ideal. I agree with this one. Africa as an ideal, that is our aspiration to be free. Ubuntu is the basis of that. I want to stop here and pause for a minute because we have a few more slides, but I want all of this to sink in, that we are working together on an epistemological approach to Africa. Any questions? I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes running through methodology. You all know this because you are PhD students, but I'm going to run through them very quickly if you have no questions. Any questions that we talked about Africa? So we're saying in this institute, when we talk about Africa, we are talking about a process of emancipation of human beings that began in a place that created human beings. That is what we're talking about. We're in this institute. Christian, any question?
Je me pose la question de savoir, est-ce que aujourd'hui on peut encore parler d'Afrique à travers les 4 conditions qu'on a déterminées? Parce que pour moi, à la lumière de tout ce que vous venez de dire, l'Afrique devient comme, je ne dirais pas un concept, mais une philosophie en fait. Et donc, qui ne peut plus être limité à un espace géographique, mais qui doit être une manière de vivre, un état d'être, et qui pourrait être attribué à toute personne dont la volonté est de d'éliminer tout ce qui est domination des uns par les autres.
Thank you. I was introducing you to the position of the South African scholar because I wanted to give you a range. I don't believe Africa is a condition to be civilized. I don't believe Africa is a commodity. I'm exposing you to these ideas. I believe that Africa is an ideal that is based on the emancipation of human beings and the humanization of the planet. And so the democracy we are struggling for is the basic democratic right to live and breathe on the planet Earth. So our democratic institute is about how to validate humanity. And that is what Africa means to me. That's what they operate. Okay, any other questions? I'm sure there are other questions. Yes. Michael, give somebody else there. Other people who have... Nobody else? Okay, go ahead, Michael.
Okay. Yeah, maybe something you mentioned. I don't know, maybe you will clarify later, but you say we cannot emancipate Africa from a capitalist perspective or from a capitalist...
Impossible. Impossible. How could Africa be emancipated under capitalism when the logic of capitalism is the exploitation and dehumanization of human beings? It means that we're accepting that some human beings must be dehumanized. So it's not the starting point.
So I think we need also then to understand what are the ideals of capitalism.
Okay. The ideals of capitalism are three. One, make profits. Two, turn things into property. And three, commodify everything. Everything is a commodity to be bought and sold. Sex, love, religion, everything becomes a commodity. And capitalism has no future in terms of the elaboration of humanity. Because capitalism is about the destruction of humanity and destruction of human life.
Well, if you're saying capitalism is the destruction of human life, then which term should we take?
For
Socialism? If you're saying capitalism is the destruction of human life, that's what you're saying, isn't it?
not what I said, that's the history.
Oh, that's the history.
That is the reality.
Oh, it's not that you believe it.
Eh?
You believe it, though.
We know that. It's not whether I believe it or not. That's the historical record. It killed 10 million people in the Congo. It killed 6 million Jews. It killed 100 million Africans. There's no debate about that.
Yeah, so if we're not taking capitalism, then what should we use as Africans?
We should use a concept that we should be free human beings. And then, as free human beings, we're looking for the social organization that can give us that freedom. And clearly that's not capitalism. Because capitalism turns us into being commodities. So, I don't know what you call it, but I know what we called it before by Sheikh Anta Diop. We call it social collectivism. That's what we called it then under Sheikh Anta Diop, because the fundamental thing that gave rise to capitalism was not there. What was that? Ownership of land and property. Africa has no such concept because we had so much land that you could come and we could give you land as big as the Congo, because property made sense in Europe. Europe is a small little place. People were grabbing the little thing called feudal principle. Africa was so big, so yes, you have 500 acres there. So private property had no meaning for us in Africa. But they introduced that in Africa, so they're trying to introduce private property and real estate in Africa, and it does make sense because Africa needs 10 billion people to really make real estate a real proposition, because people will always have other lands they can go to in Africa. Yes.
Prof, maybe you could help us to understand better also the historic reality that there were parcels of land, although sometimes belongs to the entire family. There were people who owned parcels of land which were handed to them by their parents. They own houses. How do we distinguish them from ownership of private property?
Good. Nobody owned land in Africa. Land belonged to 3 people. Those who were living on the land, you were guarding it for the ancestors, and you're protecting it from the unborn. That's the African concept of land. You know, you were just guardians for the moment, because you're not going to be here. Africa had a concept of time, which meant that they understood historical time better than capital. Capital understands time is the time to produce profit. No, Africa understands that we have a recursion process that goes back to when we were animals. That's why we have animals as our families, as our totems. So yes, over time, different places develop ideas of property. For example, Ethiopia was one place in Africa where they developed strong conception of property. And it was tied in Ethiopia to a form of feudalism where the emperor had to give land to political and military leaders to keep them to rule other parts of the empire. So Ethiopia was an exception. But that's because Ethiopia was an empire for thousands of years. But the democratic instincts of Africans, when it comes to land, meant that we have an abundance of it. We still do. The challenge is how to relate to the land to make it productive for us as human beings. You see, Africa had a disincentive towards the intensification of agriculture because Africa had so many, not just land, but animals. So there was never a shortage of food. So Africa had land, it had animals, it had fish. There was no place up to now that is as rich as, even with all the plundering that has gone, there's no place as rich as Africa. Because Africa still have that animals. How do those animals still exist? Because Africans' ideation system about animals, people come to look at animals in Africa. They've destroyed all those animals in Europe. But it is our totem system that makes us still have elephants. So they come to our game park to see our lions. They're looking at our uncles. And we preserve our uncles. So if you go into Kenya and you go into the Ngorongoro Valley, people are amazed. The Maasai is standing there and the lion is standing. How is it possible? Right, Michael? Yeah. People are shocked. The lion is standing here, and because the Maasai, after hundreds of years, know the herbs that they deal with, that the lion would never attack them because they are the family of the lions. So they're walking beside the lions. Does anyone know this? Do you know this? Could you explain, Michael or Ibrahim, about the Maasai and the lions?
exist with animals. Now in Kenya, one of the fascinating things that, who come to watch is the fact that the Maasai's closely live with wild animals, including lions. And one of the bizarre cases is that CODESRIA has a moran. One single Maasai has confront and kill a lion. And rather films that you could watch where lions try to run away from Maasai morans because they know that the morans can overcome them. But I guess what's important is a kind of balance that is struck between human beings and animals, and the balance for those of you